The San Diego Naval Medical Center always felt most like a tomb at 8 o'clock hours. It was the way the fluorescent lights hummed against the sterile white tiles, a constant, low-frequency vibration that seemed to grate on the nerves of every man in a hospital gown. Father Gabriel Sullivan moved through the corridors with a gait that was intentionally slow, a measured pace designed to project a peace he often had to fight to find within himself. In his black clerical shirt and crisp Roman collar, he looked like a man who had never known a world outside of hymnals and incense. He pushed open the heavy double doors to the physical therapy wing, where the air was thick with the scent of sweat and the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of weight machines. "Morning, gentlemen," Gabe said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that cut through the tension of the room. At the far end of the ward, Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Stone Walker was supervising a young Marine's leg lifts. The gunny gave a curt, respectful nod, the kind of acknowledgement one professional gives another, though he clearly viewed Gabe's profession as one of comfort rather than combat. But it was Corporal Tyler Rook Jensen, sitting on a training bench and rubbing a scarred shoulder, who let out a short, sharp huff of air. "Careful, Father," Jensen called out, his voice dripping with the restless energy of a bored predator. "You might trip over a dumbbell. This isn't exactly the Sunday morning choir loft." Gabe smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. He walked over, his polished black shoes clicking softly. "I think I can manage, Corporal. How is the shoulder holding up?" Jensen looked at Gabe's hands as the chaplain reached out to offer a steadying pat on the arm. Jensen pulled back slightly, holding up his own palms. They were a roadmap of violence, thick with yellowed calluses, scarred by rope burns, and stained with the faint, permanent grease of weapon maintenance. "Must be nice, Father," Jensen said, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "To have hands like that. Soft. Clean. I bet the heaviest thing you've had to lift all week is a chalice of grape juice." A few of the other Marines in the bay chuckled. Walker didn't laugh, but he didn't stop it either. He just watched Gabe with a steady, clinical gaze, wondering if the priest would break. Gabe looked down at his own hands. To Jensen, they looked like the hands of a man who had spent his life turning pages in a Bible. Gabe, however, saw the ghost of the grit under his fingernails from the streets of Fallujah. He felt the phantom heat of a scorching M4 barrel and the weight of a silver star he kept locked in a shoebox under his bed. He remembered exactly how it felt when those soft hands had applied a tourniquet to a screaming private while RPGs whistled overhead. "They're clean because I have the luxury of a sink and soap, Tyler," Gabe said quietly, his voice losing its pastoral lilt for a fraction of a second. "But don't mistake a lack of dirt for a lack of work." "Sure thing, Padre," Jensen smirked, turning back to his weights. "Just stay in your lane. We'll handle the heavy lifting. You just keep praying for us poor sinners from the safety of the chapel." Gabe didn't argue. He didn't tell them that he had already scanned the room for 2 secondary exits, identified a loose oxygen tank that could become a projectile, and noted that the gunny was favoring his left side. He simply bowed his head slightly, the silver cross around his neck catching a stray beam of San Diego sunlight. "I'll do that, Corporal," Gabe said, turning to walk away. As he reached the door, a physical therapy tray stacked with metal instruments wobbled on its wheels, beginning to tip. Before anyone in the room could react, before the gunny could even shout a warning, Gabe's hand shot out. It wasn't a fumbling grab, it was a blur of motion, a precise, tactical snatch that caught the heavy tray an inch from the floor, silent and perfectly balanced. He set the tray back on its stand without a sound. He didn't look back to see Jensen's jaw drop or the way Walker's eyes suddenly narrowed in confusion. Gabe just kept walking, the soft chaplain disappearing back into the clinical silence of the hallway, leaving the Marines to wonder exactly what kind of man they were actually dealing with. The peace of the morning didn't just break, it was detonated. Father Gabe was standing near the nurse's station, sharing a quiet word with Dr. Elena Ramirez about a patient's discharge papers, when the sound of the main entrance doors hitting the wall echoed through the atrium like a mortar round. Then came the heavy, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of boots. Not the soft squeak of medical clogs or the measured stride of shore patrol, but the aggressive, purposeful stomp of tactical footwear on linoleum. Down. Everyone on the ground now. The scream was followed by the mechanical clack slide of a bolt being racked. 2 men in black balaclavas and charcoal tactical vests burst through the glass partitions of the trauma bay, their carbines sweeping the room in practiced arcs. The medical staff froze, hands half raised, faces turning the color of bone. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Stone Walker didn't hesitate, even with his leg in a brace. His combat-hardened instincts overrode his injury. He lunged toward Gabe, his massive frame moving like a collapsing wall to intercept the chaplain. He grabbed the front of Gabe's black shirt, intending to shove the civilian behind the heavy steel-reinforced desk of the nurse's station. "Get down, father." "Behind me," Walker hissed, his voice a low, gravelly command. He braced himself to take a bullet for the man of God, his eyes fixed on the lead gunman's muzzle. But Gabe didn't move. He didn't stumble, and he didn't cower. Instead, as Walker's hand bunched the fabric of his collar, the gunny felt something he hadn't expected: resistance. Gabe was as rooted to the floor as an oak tree. "Gunny, let go," Gabe said. His voice wasn't shaking. It wasn't the voice of the man who offered soft blessings over hospital beds. It was cold, flat, and carried a frequency of command that stopped Walker's breath in his lungs. Walker looked up, and for a second, he forgot about the terrorists. Gabe wasn't looking at the gunman with fear. He was scanning. His eyes were moving in a rapid clinical sequence, left to right, ceiling to floor. 6 attackers in the initial wave, Gabe muttered, his voice barely audible over the screaming of a nearby nurse. 2 at the main entrance, 1 covering the elevators. 2 in the bay, 1 floater. They're using subcompact variants, likely 9mm high cyclic rate, low penetration on these reinforced walls. The northwest exit is obstructed by the gurney, but the service corridor behind the meds fridge is clear. Walker stared at him, his hand slowly sliding off Gabe's shirt. "Father? What are you?" "Stone, listen to me," Gabe said, leaning in close, his gaze finally locking onto the gunnies. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by a terrifying, icy clarity. "When the floater turns to check the hallway, you're going to pull Dr. Ramirez behind the counter. Do not look at the guns. Look at their feet. They're heavy on their heels. They aren't expecting a fight." A third gunman, the one Gabe had identified as the floater, stepped into the center of the bay, waving his rifle toward the group. "I said on the floor, old man. Do you want to meet your boss early?" Walker braced to lunge, his heart hammering against his ribs. But Gabe simply raised his hands halfway, not in surrender, but in a neutral, deceptive posture that masked the tension in his coils. He looked at the gunman with a serene, pitying expression that felt more like a threat than a prayer. "I'm moving," Gabe said calmly, his voice projecting just enough to draw the gunman's focus away from the wounded Marines in the corner. As Gabe stepped back toward the shadow of the service corridor, he caught Walker's eye one last time. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear: the shepherd isn't hiding. He's flanking. In that moment, Walker realized the stone wasn't the man protecting the soft shepherd. It was the other way around. The man in the Roman collar wasn't trapped in the room with terrorists. The terrorists were trapped in the room with him. The intensive care unit was supposed to be the hospital's inner sanctum, a place where the world's noise died at the threshold of heavy, pressurized doors. Here, the only sounds were the rhythmic, mechanical sighs of ventilators and the steady, reassuring pulse of cardiac monitors. It was a cathedral of science and survival. But as the doors hissed open with a violent force that cracked the glass against the stopper, that sanctity was obliterated. Kareem Haddad did not enter like a common criminal. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had studied architecture as much as ballistics. He wore no mask, unlike his men. His face was a mask of its own, composed, aristocratic, and utterly devoid of mercy. He stepped into the center of the ward, his desert-tan tactical boots leaving dark, oily smudges on the pristine floor. Behind him, 3 men in black balaclavas fanned out, their suppressed rifles carving the air into sectors of fire. Dr. Elena Ramirez stood at the central monitoring station, her hands hovering over a keyboard. She didn't move. She couldn't. The air in the room seemed to have turned to lead, pressing against her chest until breathing became a conscious, agonizing effort. Around her, 2 nurses and a black medical resident, men and women who dealt with death daily, were paralyzed. They were healers, trained to fight invisible infections and failing organs, not men with cold eyes and warm triggers. Who is in charge of this ward? Haddad's voice was a soft, cultured rasp. It was more terrifying than a shout. Elena swallowed, her throat feeling like it was lined with glass. She stepped forward, her white lab coat trembling. "I am Dr. Ramirez. We have patients here in critical condition. One of them is post-op from a triple bypass. If you disrupt their power or oxygen, you are killing them. Haddad looked at her, then glanced at the row of glass-walled rooms. In each one lay a man or woman connected to a web of tubes, the vulnerable the world had forgotten. He walked toward a bed where a young Marine lay unconscious, his head wrapped in thick gauze. "Death is merely a change in state, Doctor," Haddad said, tracing the edge of the Marine's heart rate monitor with a gloved finger. "And today, this building is no longer a hospital. It is a pulpit. From here, the world will listen to my sermon." One of the masked gunmen shoved a nurse toward the corner, the barrel of his rifle digging into the soft tissue of her neck. The nurse let out a choked sob, her eyes darting toward the medical trays scattered on the floor. The clinical environment had been violated, turned into a stage for a televised execution. The bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights made the scene feel stark and unavoidable. There were no shadows to hide in, no corners for hope to huddle. Elena looked at the armed men, then at her staff. She saw the raw, naked terror in their eyes, the realization that they were entirely, hopelessly alone. The Marines who usually guarded the lower floors were gone, or worse. The police were miles away, blocked by the very security protocols meant to keep the hospital safe. She thought of Father Gabe. She had seen him just moments ago, and a part of her wondered if he was huddled in a closet, praying for souls that were about to be extinguished. She didn't blame him. He was a man of peace, a soft soul who had no place in this nightmare. Haddad turned back to her, a cold smile touching his lips. "Lock the ward down. External communications. Internal intercoms. I want total silence. If I hear a single phone ring, I pick a bed and I stop a heart. Do you understand?" Elena nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for the console. She felt a crushing weight of failure. But as she looked past Haddad's shoulder, toward the dark rectangle of the service, vent high on the far wall, she saw something that didn't belong. A small, silver reflection, a flash of light off a metal cross, disappeared into the darkness of the ductwork. The soft chaplain wasn't praying in a closet. He was in the walls. And for the first time since the doors burst open, Elena Ramirez felt a flicker of something that wasn't terror. The air in the maintenance sublevel was cooler, thick with the scent of hydraulic fluid and the dry metallic tang of industrial dust. Gabe dropped from the ventilation shaft with a silent, cat-like precision that would have terrified Corporal Jensen. He landed in a crouch, his black clerical shoes making no sound on the concrete. For a moment he stayed there, eyes closed, listening to the hospital breathe. Above him, the faint vibrations of heavy footsteps and muffled shouts filtered through the ceiling. He moved toward a nondescript door labeled Mechanical Room 4B. It was a space most staff ignored, a graveyard for broken gurneys and outdated monitors. Inside, tucked beneath a heavy canvas tarp coated in years of undisturbed grime, sat a steel-reinforced footlocker. Gabe reached for his Roman collar. His fingers lingered on the white plastic tab, the symbol of his second life, his sanctuary. He thought of Fallujah. He thought of the amber dust that had choked the air in 2004. The chaotic roar of the radio, and the horrific moment he realized the airstrike he'd called in had hit a building held by his own men. He had traded his rifle for a cross because he believed he had lost the right to carry a weapon. He had promised God that if he could just save one soul for every one he'd mistakenly taken, it might be enough. But as the image of Dr. Ramirez's terrified face flashed in his mind, Gabe realized that sometimes the shepherd has to do more than pray for the sheep. Sometimes he has to kill the wolf. He pulled a small key from a hidden pocket in his slacks and clicked the padlock open. The lid creaked, a sound like a long-suppressed groan. The scent hit him first, CLP gun oil, old sweat, and the faint, lingering smell of cordite. It was the smell of Captain Gabriel Sullivan, 1st Marine Force Recon. Resting on top of a folded desert camo blouse was a tactical vest, its nylon webbing worn but perfectly maintained. Beside it sat a pair of blackened combat boots and a specialized radio headset. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off the black clerical shirt, exposing a torso mapped with scars that told stories he never shared in the chapel. He pulled on a dark, moisture-wicking compression shirt and slid into the tactical vest. The weight of it was familiar, a heavy, grounding comfort that anchored his drifting nerves. He reached into the bottom of the locker and pulled out a sheath. He drew the blade, a marine K-bar, its black phosphate coating dull and non-reflective. He tested the edge with his thumb. It was surgical. He strapped the knife to his thigh, the clicks of the buckles echoing in the small room like the cocking of a hammer. Gabe reached back into the locker and pulled out a roll of black tactical tape. With practiced mechanical movements, he began taping down anything that might jingle or catch. The silver cross necklace was tucked beneath his vest, pressed hard against his skin. It felt cold. He looked at his hands. They weren't soft anymore. The tremors of the chaplain had vanished, replaced by the stillness of a man who was about to go to work. He wasn't Gabriel the priest. He wasn't Father Gabe. He was the ghost of a war he'd tried to outrun, and he was the only thing standing between the innocent and the men who thought they had already won. He grabbed a pair of low-profile night vision optics, checked the battery, and clicked them onto his headgear. "Forgive me," he whispered into the dark room. He didn't say who he was asking, God, or the men he was about to face. Then, he turned off the light, and Father Gabe disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the captain behind. The hospital didn't go dark all at once. Gabe didn't just pull a lever. He performed a digital lobotomy on the building's power grid, from the depths of the mechanical room. His fingers moved across the circuit breakers with a memory that was 10 years old, but perfectly intact. He isolated the critical life support systems, the ventilators in the ICU and the cardiac monitors, ensuring they stayed on the emergency battery backup. Then, with a single, deliberate flick, he killed the rest. The transition was violent. The humming fluorescent lights, which had been the hospital's heartbeat, vanished. In their place was a silence, so heavy it felt physical. Upstairs in the trauma bay, the terrorists' world became a void. Kareem Haddad's men swore, the sound of their panic echoing off the tiled walls. They scrambled for weapon lights, the beams cutting through the dark like frantic white needles. But the light only served to narrow their vision, creating deep, impenetrable shadows where Gabe lived. Gabe clicked his night vision optics into place. The world flared into a grainy, high-contrast green. To the gunman, the hallway was a black throat. To Gabe, it was a tactical playground. He moved with a lack of friction that was unnerving, his boots finding the dead spots in the floorboards that didn't creak. He didn't start with a strike. He started with a whisper. One of Haddad's men, a jittery mercenary named Miller, was guarding the junction near the oncology ward. He swept his rifle light left, then right. When the beam passed a heavy set of double doors, he heard it, a soft metallic clink. It was the sound of a silver cross hitting a floor tile. Miller froze. "Who's there?" he hissed, his voice cracking. He stepped toward the sound, his light shaking. He found the cross. It was Gabe's, the one he had accidentally dropped. As Miller reached down, a hand emerged from the darkness behind him. It didn't reach for his throat. It pressed a cold, wet cloth over his mouth while a knee drove into the small of his back, collapsing his lungs. Gabe didn't make a sound. He didn't speak. He just dragged the man into the shadows of a patient room. 10 seconds later, Gabe emerged alone. Miller was zip-tied and gagged with medical tape, tucked under a bed like a discarded secret. In the ICU, Haddad was losing his composure. The silence was being punctuated by the thump of falling bodies and the intermittent, ghostly crackle of the internal PA system. Gabe wasn't announcing his presence. He was playing the hospital's own emergency codes. Code Silver. The automated voice whispered through the speakers in a flat, monotone loop. Code Silver. Unauthorized weapon on premises. It was psychological erosion. The gunmen were trained for a firefight against Marines, for a clear enemy they could see and shoot. They weren't prepared for the soft chaplain to become a phantom in the vents. Corporal Jensen, still restrained in the corner of the ward, watched a shadow detach itself from the ceiling tile above a second guard. He didn't see a priest. He saw a silhouette that moved with the terrifying economy of a great white. The guard didn't even have time to scream before he was pulled upward, his rifle clattering to the floor. Gabe appeared for a split second in the periphery of Jensen's vision. The green glow of the night vision goggles made his eyes look like twin emerald fires. He pressed a finger to his lips, a silent command for the Marines to stay quiet. Then, he vanished again, leaving only the smell of gun oil and the cold realization that the man they had mocked wasn't just a soldier. He was the dark itself. Haddad's voice finally broke the quiet, a desperate, angry shout. "Show yourself. You think a few lights are going to save you?" From the darkness of the nurse's station, Gabe's voice returned, no longer pastoral, but echoing with the weight of a captain's authority. "I'm not trying to save myself, Kareem. I'm giving you your last rites." The ICU was a tomb of emerald and shadow. Corporal Tyler Rook, Jensen sat with his back against a cold gurney, his wrists burning against the bite of industrial-grade zip ties. His breath hitched in his chest, shallow and jagged. He had spent his life believing that fear was something you could train away. But staring into the absolute black of a hallway, where men were disappearing one by one, was a different kind of terror. Beside him, Gunny Walker was a statue of suppressed rage. The older Marine's eyes were fixed on the doorway, tracking the frantic, sweeping beams of the two remaining terrorists' weapon lights. "He's still out there," Jensen whispered, his voice cracking. "Whoever that is, he just took out Miller and the guy by the vents without making a single sound. Gunny, that's not the police. That's a ghost." Walker didn't answer. He was listening to the rhythm of the footfalls, or the lack thereof. He knew that movement. It was a predatory, low-profile glide that favored the outside of the feet to minimize floor slap. It was the movement of a man who had been taught to kill in the dark long before he had been taught to save souls. Suddenly, the heavy door to the equipment room hissed open. A figure detached itself from the gloom, moving with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. One of Haddad's men whirled around, his rifle light cutting through the air. But the figure was already gone, sliding beneath the line of sight. A flash of steel, a K-bar blade, glinted in the strobing light. There was a sickening thud, the sound of a heavy body hitting the floor, and then silence. The figure stepped into the faint, green glow of a nearby cardiac monitor. Jensen's breath hitched. The night vision optics were flipped up now, resting on the man's forehead like a crown of glass. Beneath them was a face Jensen recognized, yet didn't know at all. The soft, apologetic lines around the eyes had hardened into granite. The mouth that had offered quiet blessings was a thin, ruthless line. It was Father Gabe. But he wasn't wearing his clerical shirt. He was in a tactical vest, his arms corded with muscle. The silver cross he always wore now taped flat against his chest to prevent it from reflecting light. In his hand was a suppressed handgun, held in a perfect, high-ready grip. "Father," Jensen gasped, his brain struggling to reconcile the soft chaplain with the lethal shadow standing 5 feet away. "What? How are you doing this?" Gabe didn't look at him immediately. He kept his weapon trained on the hallway, his head tilted as he processed the auditory data of the building. When he finally turned his gaze toward the two Marines, Jensen felt a cold shiver race down his spine. The soft hands he had mocked were currently covered in tactical gloves, steady as a heartbeat. "You said you'd handle the heavy lifting, Corporal," Gabe said. His voice was a low, resonant rasp that carried the weight of 1,000 combat patrols. "I'm just here to make sure you have a room to do it in." He moved toward them, the knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. With 2 quick, precise movements, he severed their restraints. Walker stood up, rubbing his circulation back into his wrists, his eyes locked on Gabe's chest. He saw the way the vest sat, perfectly balanced. He saw the scars on Gabe's forearms that weren't from surgery. "Force Recon," Walker stated, his voice a mix of awe and realization. "Captain Sullivan, Fallujah 04. I heard the stories about the ghost of the Green Zone. I just never thought I'd be taking communion from him." Gabe's expression flickered, a brief shadow of the pain he'd tried to bury, but he suppressed it instantly. "Captain Sullivan died in a desert a long time ago, Gunny. Today, I'm just a man trying to keep his hospital clean." Jensen looked down at his own hands, then at Gabe's. He remembered his joke about clean civilian hands and felt a hot flush of shame. The man hadn't been hiding because he was weak. He had been hiding because he was a weapon that had seen enough war for 10 lifetimes. "I'm sorry, Father," Jensen whispered. Gabe checked the magazine on his sidearm with a sharp, metallic click. "Save the confession for Sunday, Rook. Right now, Kareem Haddad is in the ICU with Dr. Ramirez. I need you two to provide rear security while I go through the ceiling. Do you still have enough fight left in you to follow a priest into hell?" Walker straightened his shoulders, his military bearing returning in full force. He didn't see a chaplain anymore. He saw a commander. "Lead the way, Captain." The ICU was a cathedral of shadows, lit only by the rhythmic, ghostly pulsing of the life support machines. Kareem Haddad stood in the center of the ward, his back to the large observation windows. He held Dr. Elena Ramirez by the arm, his pistol pressed against her temple. He was no longer the composed architect of terror. The silence of the hospital and the disappearance of his men had stripped away his veneer, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. "I know you're here." Haddad screamed into the darkness, his voice cracking against the glass walls. "You think you're a ghost? "You're just a man. Come out, or the doctor dies." High above, nestled in the shadows of the ceiling's maintenance crawlspace, Gabe watched. He was directly over the main nurse's station, looking down through a removed acoustic tile. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline that Jensen or Walker would have. He felt only the cold, mathematical clarity of a force recon operator. He saw the angle of Haddad's grip, the tremor in the man's trigger finger, and the way Elena's eyes were squeezed shut, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Gabe reached into his tactical vest. He didn't pull out a flashbang or a grenade. He reached for the silver cross that had been pressed against his chest. He unclipped the chain, letting the heavy, polished metal dangle between his fingers. A single, narrow beam of emergency spotlighting was cutting across the ward from a high-angle security lamp. Gabe timed it. He waited for the exact moment Haddad turned his head to scan the left corridor. With a flick of his wrist, Gabe angled the cross into the light. A needle-sharp glint of silver reflected off the polished metal, lancing across the room and striking Haddad directly in the eyes. It was a momentary flare, a celestial spark in the gloom, but it was enough. Haddad flinched, his vision whited out by the sudden, concentrated glare. He blinked, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. In that heartbeat, the ceiling seemed to explode. Gabe didn't just drop. He transitioned from the air to the floor with the force of a falling anvil. He hit the industrial linoleum in a controlled roll and launched himself upward before Haddad could even regain his focus. The disarm was a blur of high-level Krav Maga and Recon CQC. Gabe's left hand shot out, his palm striking the back of Haddad's weapon hand, forcing the muzzle away from Elena. Simultaneously, his right elbow drove into Haddad's solar plexus, stealing the man's breath. With a brutal, twisting motion, Gabe snapped Haddad's wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor, sliding across the tiles. Elena stumbled back, gasping, as Gabe stepped into Haddad's personal space. The terrorist leader reached for a combat knife at his belt, but he was moving through water compared to the man in front of him. Gabe caught the man's arm, pivoted on his heel, and sent Haddad crashing face first into the heavy metal edge of a medical supply cart. The sound of the impact echoed through the ward, the final, heavy note of the confrontation. Gabe didn't follow up with a killing blow. He stood over the groaning man, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He picked up the fallen pistol, cleared the chamber with a practiced snap, and tucked it into his waistband. Haddad looked up, blood trickling from his nose, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He looked at Gabe, really looked at him, seeing the tactical vest over the clerical undershirt, the K-bar on his thigh, and the silver cross now lying on the floor between them. What are you?" Haddad wheezed. Gabe reached down and retrieved the cross, his fingers closing around the metal. He looked at Elena, who was shaking but alive, and then back at the broken man on the floor. "I'm the one who's going to hear your confession," Gabe said, his voice returning to the calm, steady baritone of the hospital chaplain. "But first, you're going to help me save these patients." The altar of the ICU was quiet again. The only sound the steady beep 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 of the heart monitors, the rhythm of lives that had been bought and paid for by a man who had finally learned that his hands could be both soft enough to bless and hard enough to protect. The sun began to bleed over the San Diego horizon, casting long, amber fingers through the shattered glass of the medical center's atrium. Outside, the world was a cacophony of rotating sirens and shouting voices, but inside the ICU, the silence was heavy and thick, like the air after a summer storm. The emergency lights had been restored to a steady clinical hum, washing away the grainy green shadows of the night. When the heavy doors finally hissed open, they didn't yield to terrorists. A stack of FBI HRT operators in full tactical gear surged in, weapons high, followed closely by a detachment of active-duty recon Marines. They moved with a violent, synchronized precision, expecting a bloodbath or a barricaded nightmare. Instead, they found a scene that brought the lead point man to a confused halt. Kareem Haddad and his remaining men were not dead, but they were utterly broken. They were zip-tied to the base of heavy equipment racks. Their weapons cleared and piled neatly on a central nursing station like a macabre offering. There were no shell casings on the floor, no signs of a spray-and-pray firefight. It was a surgical victory, a quiet, absolute neutralization. Corporal Tyler Jensen and Gunny Walker stood near the entrance, their posture rigid, their faces masks of exhaustion and a new, profound kind of pride. Jensen didn't look like the skeptic anymore. He looked like a man who had seen a miracle and was still trying to find the words for it. In the center of the ward, the unseen ghost had vanished. In his place sat Father Gabe. He was back in his black clerical shirt, the Roman collar straight and white against his neck. The tactical vest, the night vision optics, and the K-bar were gone, vanished back into the shadows of the mechanical sublevel. His hands, which had snapped bone and dismantled rifles just an hour prior, were once again soft, folded gently over a prayer book as he knelt beside the bed of a wounded private. Gabe was whispering. It wasn't a tactical report or a command. It was the 23rd Psalm, his voice a low, steady anchor in the aftermath of the chaos. Dr. Elena Ramirez stood nearby, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She watched the chaplain with an expression that bordered on reverence. When the FBI field in charge approached her, demanding to know where the primary combatant was, the one who had dismantled a professional terrorist cell in total darkness, she simply pointed a trembling finger toward the man in the collar. The lead recon Marine, a captain with 3 combat tours under his belt, walked up to Gabe. He looked at the neatly stacked rifles, then at the chaplain's calm, unassuming profile. He recognized the efficiency of the work. He saw the way the zip ties were angled, the way the perimeter had been secured. "Father," the captain asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "My men say they were assisted by a force recon operator, someone who knew our old SOPs better than they do." Gabe didn't look up immediately. He finished his prayer, made the sign of the cross over the sleeping soldier, and then slowly stood. He looked tired, not the fatigue of a soldier after a march, but the deep, spiritual weariness of a man who had been forced to revisit a ghost he thought he'd laid to rest. "I'm just the chaplain, Captain," Gabe said, his voice returning to its gentle, pastoral lilt. "I was just checking on my flock. It's a dangerous world. Sometimes people trip and fall." The captain looked at Gabe's hands. They were clean, but there was a faint, lingering scent of gun oil that the hospital soap couldn't quite mask. He looked into Gabe's eyes and saw the ghost of Fallujah staring back, a warrior who had found a different way to fight. The Marine didn't ask any more questions. He stepped back, snapped his heels together, and delivered a crisp, formal salute. One by one, the other Marines in the room, Jensen, Walker, and the new arrivals followed suit. Gabe didn't salute back. He simply offered a small, tired smile and a nod of blessing. He turned back to the wounded, the silver cross around his neck catching the morning light. A shepherd once again in a world that finally understood exactly what he was willing to do to protect it. The following Tuesday morning, the San Diego Naval Medical Center smelled exactly as it always had: floor wax, industrial coffee, and the faint underlying scent of salt air blowing in from the harbor. But as Father Gabe pushed through the heavy double doors of the physical therapy wing, the atmosphere didn't just change, it settled. The rhythmic clink-clink-clink of the weight machines didn't falter. Instead, as the chaplain moved toward the center of the ward, the room underwent a silent, tectonic shift. CPL. Tyler Rook, Jensen, was on the pull-up bar, his face strained with the effort of his recovery. When he spotted the black clerical shirt and the silver cross in his peripheral vision, he didn't drop a joke about soft hands or choir lofts. Jensen dropped to the floor, his boots hitting the mat with a dull thud. He didn't say a word. He simply stood at attention, his back straight, his eyes locked forward in a gaze of absolute, unshakable respect. Beside him, 2 other Marines who had been mid-set followed suit. There was no command given, no officer present to demand it. It was the instinctive, reverent silence of men who had seen a lion step out of the grass. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Stone, Walker, was near the window, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't snap to attention like the younger men. He simply stood, his head bowing slightly in a gesture that was half prayer, half salute. "Morning, gentlemen," Gabe said. His voice was the same as it had been for months, calm, resonant, and gentle. But the pastoral lilt no longer felt like a mask to the men in the room. It felt like a choice. It was the peace of a man who knew exactly how much violence he was capable of, and chose to offer a blessing instead. Gabe walked over to Jensen, who was still standing rigid. The chaplain reached out and placed a hand on the young Marine's shoulder. His touch was light, but Jensen could feel the immense, grounded strength behind it, the same strength that had held a suppressed pistol with terrifying stillness in the dark. "At ease, Tyler," Gabe said softly. "You're here to heal, not to stand for inspection." Jensen relaxed his shoulders, but his eyes stayed on Gabe's hands. They were clean, yes. They They were soft in the way a healer's hands should be. But Jensen finally understood that the lack of dirt didn't mean a lack of work. It meant the work was done. I'm heading down to the ICU to check on Dr. Ramirez and the patients from last week, Gabe continued, looking around the room. If any of you feel like talking, really talking, my door is open. And it's not just a chapel anymore. It's a sanctuary. He turned to leave, his gait measured and unhurried. He didn't walk like a captain of Force Recon. And he didn't fumble like a rookie. He walked like a man who had finally integrated the two halves of his soul. He was the shepherd who had survived the wolves. And he carried the scars of both. As the doors hissed shut behind him, the Marines didn't immediately go back to their weights. They stood for a moment longer, looking at the space where he had been. They knew that the warrior priest wasn't hiding anymore. He was simply on watch. The uniform comes off, but the warrior never does. And at the San Diego Naval Medical Center, the quietest man in the building had become the loudest reminder that some things, like faith and brotherhood, and the strength to protect the innocent, are built to last.